The principal humiliated Barron Trump and called his parents. But when Melania and Donald Trump came to the school, she immediately regretted it. What happened next surprised everyone. Don't forget to subscribe and leave comments where you're watching from. The black SUV rolled to a smooth stop in front of Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School. Its tinted windows reflected the gleaming stone facade of one of New York's most exclusive private schools. The doors opened, and out stepped a tall, lean teenager dressed in a crisp white shirt and plain slacks. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and took a deep breath. This was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh start. Barron Naves, as he was officially registered in the school's records, paused for a moment, taking in the imposing entrance. The columns flanking the double doors loomed above him, as if silently judging his presence. He ran a hand through his dark blonde hair and glanced toward the driver, who nodded encouragingly from behind the wheel before pulling away. No one in the school knew his real identity yet. He wasn't Barron Trump here, just another new student trying to find his place. That's how he wanted it. His parents had agreed to let him use his mother's maiden name to avoid the assumptions and attention that usually followed his last name. He wanted to be seen for who he was, not for the family he came from. As Barron approached the steps, the buzz of conversations and laughter spilled out through the glass doors. Students in tailored blazers and polished shoes moved in clusters, their voices casual yet deliberate, a blend of privilege and confidence. He squared his shoulders and stepped inside. The entrance hall was immaculate. Polished marble floors gleamed under the light of an ornate chandelier. Framed photographs of alumni lined the walls, their names engraved in gold beneath smiling faces. Barron noticed that most of them bore last names that he recognized from headlines and business empires. A man in a security uniform blocked his path almost immediately. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his tone polite but firm. "I'm new, Barron Naves," he said, keeping his voice steady. The guard scanned him quickly, taking in the understated clothes and lack of any visible designer labels. His eyes lingered just long enough for Barron to feel it. The subtle assessment, the judgment. "I'll need to see some ID," the guard said. Barron reached into his pocket and handed over his school-issued identification card. The guard looked at it, then at Barron, his lips twitching slightly before he finally stepped aside. "Welcome," he said without warmth. Barron slipped past him, already feeling the weight of being an outsider. The murmurs started almost immediately. Students turned to look at him as he walked down the hall, their eyes darting toward his shoes, his bag, his face. He heard snippets of conversation. Words like transfer, new kid, and no way he's rich enough. Barron kept his head high, pretending not to notice. Inside the main office, a secretary directed him to the principal's office for orientation. The room was as intimidating as the rest of the building. Bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, dark wood furniture polished to a shine. Behind the desk sat a woman who looked as though she had been carved from stone. Principal Kinley's hair was perfectly sculpted into a severe bob, and her tailored suit fit her as sharply as the judgment in her eyes. She rose as Barron entered, but didn't extend a hand. "Mr. Naves, I presume?" she said, her tone clipped. "Yes, ma'am." She gestured for him to sit. Barron perched on the edge of the leather chair, feeling her eyes rake over him. "I trust you understand the standards we uphold here," Kinley said. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to being in control. "This is not just a school. It's an institution built on tradition and excellence. Students are expected to represent those values at all times." Barron nodded. "I understand." her lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope so. We value discipline and decorum above all else. Some students find that adjustment challenging." Barron knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't a warning. It was a judgment already passed. "I'll do my best," he said. Kinley's eyes narrowed slightly as though she didn't believe him, but she nodded and stood. "You'll find your schedule at the front desk. Welcome to Columbia Grammar." The dismissal was clear. Barron rose and left the office, her words echoing in his head. By the time he reached his first class, the weight of the school's expectations and unspoken judgments hung heavily over him. In the math classroom, the teacher barely glanced at him as he handed over the seating chart. Barron's name was scrawled at the bottom, squeezed into the last desk at the back. As he made his way there, students whispered behind cupped hands. The teacher, Mr. Reynolds, began the lesson without introducing him. Barron tried to focus, but every movement felt magnified under the weight of the stairs. When he raised his hand to answer a question, Reynolds ignored him, calling instead on a girl in the front row. Barron's hand dropped, and he forced himself to stay calm. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. Teachers brushed past him, classmates avoided eye contact, and the cafeteria staff took their time serving his lunch, handing him a tray only after everyone else had been served. By the end of the day, Barron was exhausted, but he refused to let it show. He kept his shoulders straight and his steps even as he walked to his locker. That was when he saw it, a crumpled note shoved into the vent. He pulled it out and unfolded it. "You don't belong here." The words were scrawled in uneven letters, and Barron's stomach tightened. He looked around, but no one was watching. Crumpling the paper, he shoved it into his pocket and closed his locker. Outside, the driver was waiting. Barron slid into the back seat and stared out the window as the car pulled away. "Everything okay, sir?" the driver asked. "Fine," Barron said quickly. He didn't want to talk about it. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, willing himself to believe that tomorrow would be better. But deep down, he already knew that it wouldn't be. The following days brought no relief. Barron quickly realized that the whispers and sidelong glances from his first day had hardened into something more deliberate, a quiet but pervasive exclusion. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, seen but ignored, occupying space without ever being acknowledged. The other students had settled into their routines, and Barron remained an outsider. No one invited him to join their conversations, no one made room for him at their tables, and no one even bothered to ask who he was or where he had come from. Barron tried to focus on his classes, but the teachers seemed just as indifferent as the students. In history class, Mr. Harris, one of the school's longest-serving instructors, seized every opportunity to remind Barron of his status as an outsider. On Monday morning, as the lesson turned to modern politics, Harris's eyes flicked toward Barron with a hint of amusement. "Now, let's consider how wealth and privilege have shaped recent American history," Harris began, pacing at the front of the room. "What happens when power is handed to those who lack the experience to wield it responsibly?" The comment hung in the air. A few students snickered, their eyes darting toward Barron, who remained silent. "Of course," Harris continued, "history often repeats itself, doesn't it? Leadership should be earned, not inherited. But as we've seen, sometimes names speak louder than qualifications." The laughter grew louder this time, but Harris didn't stop. Barron's hands curled into fists under his desk. He wanted to speak up, to challenge the teacher's thinly veiled attack, but he knew it would only make things worse. Confrontation wouldn't help. He needed to endure. By lunch, the tension had followed him out of the classroom and into the cafeteria. Barron found an empty table near the back, but before he could sit down, a group of students occupied the seats around him, leaving no space. They didn't say a word, just stared at him until he backed away. He settled for a seat by the trash cans where he ate quickly, avoiding eye contact. The staff in the cafeteria seemed to treat him no better. When he stepped into line, the server behind the counter looked right past him and moved to the next student. "Excuse me," Barron said, trying to keep his voice even. The woman didn't look up. "Hey," he said a little louder, "can I get lunch, please?" She finally turned, her expression neutral but her tone sharp. "You'll have to wait. We're busy." Barron looked around. The line had thinned. He was the only one left. Still, he waited. By the time he sat down with his tray, most of the other students had finished their meals. He ate in silence, the noise of the cafeteria fading into the background. It was a pattern that repeated itself throughout the week. Teachers ignored his questions, students pushed past him in the halls, and cafeteria staff treated him as though he were invisible. But the worst came on Friday. Barron arrived at English class to find his desk covered in crumpled papers. Notes scrawled with insults, "fake," "loser," and "daddy's money," littered his seat and the floor around it. The teacher, Miss Bradley, walked in, glanced at the mess, and said nothing. Barron stood frozen for a moment, then began picking up the papers. The class watched, whispering and laughing as he worked. When he finally sat down, Miss Bradley turned to him. "I hope this won't be a distraction for you, Mr. Navs," she said, her voice laced with condescension. Barron clenched his jaw and nodded. But the humiliation wasn't over. Later that afternoon, as he was heading to his locker, another student, Jason, deliberately walked into him, knocking his books to the floor. "Watch it," Jason snapped, though it was clear the collision had been intentional. Barron bent to pick up his books, but Jason kicked one of them down the hall. "What's wrong, Navs?" Jason sneered. "Can't handle a little pressure?" Barron's pulse quickened. He wanted to fight back, to shove Jason away, but he forced himself to stay calm. He retrieved his books and walked away, ignoring the laughter that followed him. But Jason wasn't finished. In the final class of the day, he sat behind Barron, whispering insults under his breath. Barron tried to block it out, but the tension kept building until he couldn't take it anymore. When the bell rang, he turned sharply, his voice low but firm. "Leave me alone." Jason smirked. Or what? Before Barron could respond, the teacher stepped in. "What's going on here?" Barron opened his mouth to explain, but Jason cut him off. "He started it," Jason said. "Pushed me in the hall earlier." The teacher looked at Barron, frowning. "Mr. Navs, my office, now." Barron's stomach sank. By the time he reached Principal Kinley's office, he was already bracing for the worst. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Barron sat, his hands gripping the armrests. "Explain," Kinley said. Barron recounted the events of the day, careful to keep his tone even. When he finished, Kinley leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "So, you're telling me that this was all just a misunderstanding?" "Yes." She shook her head. "I don't buy it. I've seen your type before, Mr. Navs. Students who think the rules don't apply to them, who think they can talk their way out of trouble." Barron's jaw tightened. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Not according to the witnesses," Kinley said, "and considering your behavior since you arrived, I'm inclined to believe them." Barron's heart pounded. "Your attitude has been a problem since day one," Kinley continued. You think you can just walk in here and act like you own the place? This is Columbia grammar. We don't tolerate entitlement." Barron's throat burned, but he refused to let her see him falter. "I'm calling your parents," Kinley said finally. "We'll see what they have to say about this." Barron's stomach twisted. "They'll be here tomorrow morning," Kinley added, "and I suggest you prepare yourself. This behavior ends now." Barron left the office feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew the truth would come out eventually. He just hadn't expected it to happen like this. Tomorrow would change everything. The next morning, Barron arrived at school earlier than usual. Sleep had eluded him the night before, leaving him to wrestle with frustration and dread. Principal Kinley's words rang in his head, her accusations echoing louder with each passing hour. He had replayed their conversation again and again, searching for a way he could have defended himself better, but it didn't matter now. She had already made up her mind. As he stepped into the nearly empty hallways, his footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual. Students would begin arriving soon, and with them would come the whispers, the stares, and the judgment. But this morning wasn't just about them. It was about his parents. Kinley's confidence had been undeniable the day before, her tone dripping with superiority as she threatened to bring in Barron's parents. She clearly expected them to be powerless, a weak link she could manipulate to put him in his place. She had no idea who she was about to meet. Barron's stomach twisted at the thought. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want reporters or cameras, and he definitely didn't want the other students gawking at him. But at this point, he didn't have a choice. By the time the first bell rang, the hallways were alive with chatter. Barron's presence drew more attention than usual, the rumor mill working overtime. Word had spread. He was in trouble, his parents were coming in, and speculation ran wild about what would happen next. "Maybe they're getting expelled," someone whispered behind him as he walked toward Kinley's office. "I heard his dad's broke," another voice said. "That's probably why he's here in the first place." Barron ignored them and kept walking. Principal Kinley's office door was slightly ajar when he arrived, and he could already hear voices inside. She was talking to someone, likely another teacher, her tone sharp and commanding. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, then forced himself to push it open. Kinley looked up, her expression immediately hardening. She sat behind her desk, flanked by two teachers who looked equally unimpressed. "Mr. Knavs," she said, gesturing for him to sit, "you're early." Barron sat without responding, his back straight and his hands folded in his lap. Kinley studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "Your parents should be arriving soon, and I want to make a few things clear before they do." Barron's stomach churned, but he kept his face neutral. "This school prides itself on discipline and integrity," Kinley continued. "We have a responsibility to maintain those standards, and we can't afford to make exceptions." Barron's jaw tightened. "Your behavior this week has raised serious concerns," she went on, "and it's important that we address them now, before they escalate further." Barron opened his mouth to respond, but Kinley held up a hand to silence him. "I don't want to hear excuses," she said sharply. "Your parents will be here shortly, and we'll discuss this with them directly." Before Barron could say another word, there was a knock at the door. Kinley's expression shifted to one of practiced authority as she stood and smoothed her skirt. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and the room seemed to shift. Melania Trump stepped inside first, her presence commanding and deliberate. She wore a fitted black coat and heels that clicked softly against the tile as she crossed the room. Her expression was calm but unreadable, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Barron. Behind her, Donald Trump followed, his broad frame filling the doorway. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his usual confidence radiating from every movement. The room fell silent. Principal Kinley's face drained of color as recognition dawned. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The two teachers flanking her exchanged panicked glances, their earlier smugness evaporating. Donald Trump broke the silence. "We're here to discuss my son," he said, his voice low and firm. "I understand there's been some sort of misunderstanding." Kinley blinked, struggling to regain her composure. "Mr. Trump?" she stammered. "Mrs. Trump, Donald raised a hand, silencing her as easily as she had silenced Barron the day before. "I'd like to hear what's going on," he said. Kinley swallowed hard and gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. "Please, have a seat." Melania and Donald sat down, their presence dominating the small room. Barron remained silent, his heart pounding as he watched Kinley flounder. "Well," Kinley began, her voice trembling slightly, "there have been some incidents involving Barron, Mr. Nabbs, over the past week. Nothing serious, of course, but we do have certain expectations here, and we need to make sure—" "Let me stop you right there," Donald interrupted. Kinley froze. "I've been hearing a lot about your expectations," he said. "What I haven't heard is how you've treated my son, because from what I understand, he's been harassed and humiliated since the day he arrived." Kinley opened her mouth to protest, but Donald didn't give her the chance. "And you let it happen," he said. "Not just the students, your staff, your teachers, you." Melania leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp. "We trusted this school," she said. "We believed it was a place of excellence and fairness. But you made assumptions about our son the moment he walked through that door." Kinley's face flushed. "Mrs. Trump, I assure you—" "No," Melania said, cutting her off. "You don't assure me of anything. You let this happen, and now we're here to fix it." Donald leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of Melania's words settle. "I want to know how you plan to make this right," he said. Kinley stammered, her earlier confidence completely gone. I'll personally review the situation," she said, "and we'll take immediate steps to address any issues." "That's not enough," Donald said. "We'll be following up with your board and making sure real changes happen." Kinley nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she reached for a pen. Barron watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening as relief and vindication washed over him. When the meeting ended, Kinley's shoulders sagged as the Trumps rose to leave. But Donald paused at the door. "One more thing," he said, looking over his shoulder. "I expect you to apologize to my son." Kinley's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "I'm sorry," she said softly, not meeting Barron's eyes. It was too late for apologies. As Barron walked out of the office behind his parents, the whispers in the hallway stopped. Everything had changed. The hallways were silent as Barron followed his parents out of Principal Kinley's office. The air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The moment they stepped through the door, students lingering nearby scattered, their whispers chasing Barron down the corridor like a shadow. Donald Trump's words still rang in Barron's ears, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to forget. Melania's icy precision had sliced through Kinley's defenses like a scalpel, leaving the once imposing principal scrambling to save face. But Barron couldn't shake the lingering discomfort in his chest. The apology had come too late, and no words could erase the humiliation of the past week. Donald slowed his pace, glancing at Barron. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Barron nodded automatically, though his grip tightened on the strap of his bag. Melania, walking just ahead, glanced back, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "You don't have to stay here," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Barron considered the offer. Leaving would be easy. No more stares, no more whispers, no more teachers with thinly veiled contempt. But a part of him bristled at the thought of retreat. If he left now, wouldn't that mean they had won? "I'll finish the day," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Donald and Melania exchanged a look, but neither argued. "All right," Donald said, "but we'll talk tonight." With that, they left, their footsteps echoing through the marble hall as they disappeared down the front steps. Barron took a deep breath and turned back toward his locker. The rest of the day crawled by, each class heavier than the last. Teachers avoided eye contact, their earlier smugness replaced by strained politeness. Mr. Harris, the history teacher who had delighted in his veiled insults, didn't so much as glance in Barron's direction. Miss Bradley, the English teacher who had mocked him publicly, stumbled through the lesson without calling on him once. Even Jason, the student who had led the taunts and provoked the confrontation, avoided him entirely. Barron caught him darting into another hallway when their paths crossed, his usual bravado replaced by unease. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Barron could feel the tension in every glance, every pause, every whispered conversation that stopped the moment he walked by. He had become a spectacle, no longer the target of open hostility but the subject of nervous curiosity. By the end of the day, Barron had had enough. He grabbed his bag and headed straight for the doors, ignoring the stairs as he pushed into the cold afternoon air. The black SUV was already waiting, the driver stepping out to open the door. Barron climbed in, leaning back against the seat as the car pulled away. The ride home felt longer than usual, the city blurring past the windows. Barron's mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the meeting, the apology, the sudden shift in everyone's behavior. But no matter how much he tried to push it away, one thought kept creeping back in. This wasn't over. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Melania and Donald sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, the space between them filled with polished silverware and plates of untouched food. Barron pushed his fork around his plate, his appetite long gone. Donald was the first to break the silence. "I don't like leaving you there," he said, setting his glass down with a sharp clink. Melania nodded. "Neither do I." Barron looked up, his expression guarded. "I can handle it," he said. "Can you?" Donald asked, leaning forward. "Because that's not what I saw today. That wasn't handling it. That was surviving it." Barron flinched but held his ground. "I'm not running away." "No one said anything about running," Melania said. Her voice was softer than Donald's but just as firm. "But we need to know if this is the right place for you." Barron swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I need to finish what I started," he said. Donald studied him for a long moment, then leaned back with a sigh. "All right," he said, "but this doesn't end here." The next week was a blur of changes. News of the confrontation with Principal Kinley had spread beyond the walls of the school. Local newspapers picked up the story, framing it as a clash between power and privilege. Social media exploded with speculation, and before long, reporters began showing up outside the school gates. Barron hated the attention. Every time he stepped out of the SUV, he felt the cameras on him, their lenses hungry for any sign of weakness. He forced himself to keep walking, shoulders squared and chin high, but the pressure never eased. Inside the school, things were different too. Principal Kinley avoided him entirely, her earlier arrogance replaced by cautious distance. The teachers, who had once dismissed him, now treated him with forced kindness, their smiles brittle and uncomfortable. Even the students had shifted. Some still whispered behind his back, but others approached him cautiously, their curiosity outweighing their judgment. A few even apologized, though their words felt hollow. Barron accepted the apologies but didn't linger. He didn't trust the sudden shift in attitude, and he wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine. 2 weeks later, Principal Kinley resigned. The announcement came during the morning assembly, delivered by the school board chair. Kinley cited personal reasons for her departure, but everyone knew the truth. Barron sat in the back of the auditorium, watching as the teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He felt no satisfaction, only a strange emptiness. When the assembly ended, he walked out alone, leaving the whispers behind. By the end of the semester, Barron made his decision. He packed up his locker, cleared out his desk, and walked through the doors of Columbia Grammar for the last time. Melania and Donald supported his choice, helping him transition to a new school where he wouldn't carry the weight of the past. But Barron didn't leave quietly. Before he left, he gave a speech during the final assembly, addressing the entire student body. "Respect isn't something you wear or something you inherit," he said, his voice steady. "It's something you earn by treating others the way you want to be treated." The room fell silent, every eye locked on him. "I came here hoping to be judged by who I am, not by where I come from. But what I learned is that respect can't be demanded. It has to be given." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And it's time this school started giving it." As Barron stepped outside for the last time, the sun was setting over the city. The cameras were gone, the reporters had moved on, and for the first time in weeks, he felt free. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't afraid anymore. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and watch other episodes on our channel.